In his newly obtained birth certificate, it shows Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor arrived May 6th, not at their new home Frogmore Cottage like many had expected, but rather at a London hospital.
He's also said that because of the current situation, his father, the king, isn't speaking to him.
There are documents the monarchy treats as sacred. Birth certificates are one of them. They don't exist for feelings. They exist for certainty, for family lineage, for continuity. And when even a whisper emerges that such a document may not say what the public believes, it does. The consequences are not emotional, they are institutional. According to a palace insider, the document tied to Archie's birth did not simply raise questions, it changed how the crown understood everything that followed. And when Prince Harry finally saw what was being discussed, the reaction was not anger, it was grief. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about paperwork, procedure, and the moment certainty collapses. Because when truth is reduced to ink on a page, even princes are forced to confront what cannot be rewritten. In the monarchy, public announcements are designed for reassurance. Documents are designed for permanence. Birth certificates fall into the second category. They are not ceremonial, they are legal instruments used to establish lineage, nationality, and historical record. Unlike press releases, they are not written to persuade, they are written to endure. That distinction is where this story begins. When Archie Mountbatten Windsor was born, the public focus remained on surface details, the timing of the announcement, the hospital references, the absence of the traditional easel outside the gates. Those choices were debated briefly and then absorbed into a broader narrative of modernization. What the public did not see was the quieter process unfolding behind palace walls. Inside Buckingham Palace, documentation moved through its usual channels. Clerks recorded details. Legal advisors reviewed language. Protocol officers checked alignment with precedent. This is routine. It happens with every royal birth, regardless of rank. The goal is not celebration, it is accuracy. According to a palace insider, later familiar with the review process, the initial concern was not dramatic, it was technical. Language on the birth certificate differed from standard formatting used in previous royal records. Titles were handled differently. Descriptions of parental information did not mirror past documents. None of this suggested wrongdoing, but it did trigger questions. In institutions, questions do not imply suspicion. They imply responsibility. At first, the discrepancies were treated as administrative. Variations are not unusual when births take place outside traditional royal settings. However, as advisors cross-referenced the certificate with public statements and internal records, inconsistencies remained unresolved. The issue was not that something was clearly wronged, it was that clarity was missing where it was normally absolute. This is where the palace slowed down. Files were reopened, legal counsel was consulted. The aim was not to correct the record, but to understand it. Once a birth certificate is issued, it cannot be altered without formal legal action. Interpretation, however, can change, and interpretation is where institutions protect themselves. The insider described the atmosphere as cautious, not alarmist or emergency meetings, no accusations, just a recognition that the document did not close its own file in the way royal documents usually do. Prince Harry was not immediately involved. According to those familiar with the sequence, advisors hesitated before briefing him, not because information was being withheld maliciously, but because of the emotional stakes. Birth certificates are impersonal, family is not. The palace had learned, through past crises, that mixing the two prematurely can escalate situations unnecessarily. When Harry was eventually informed that questions had been raised, the reaction was not defensive, it was confusion. He had assumed the paperwork was routine, that whatever deviations existed had been resolved quietly. Instead, he learned that the document was still being discussed internally, not as a scandal, but as an anomaly. For someone raised inside an institution where procedure equals security, that knowledge was destabilizing. According to the insider, Harry asked the same question repeatedly. What exactly is wrong? The answer each time was measured. Nothing is wrong. Something is unclear. That distinction mattered. The palace's concern was not about denying parentage or questioning legitimacy. Those claims were never made. The concern was procedural integrity. Royal records are expected to align with each other precisely. When they do not, future questions become harder to manage. As internal discussions continued, factions formed quietly. One group argued that any internal doubt should be resolved privately and never acknowledged. Public confidence depended on finality. Raising questions, even internally, risked validating external speculation. This camp prioritized stability above all else. Another group believed unresolved ambiguity was more dangerous than transparency. They argued that, if questions ever surfaced later, the palace needed to demonstrate it had identified and addressed them early. Silence, they warned, could be misinterpreted as avoidance. Prince Harry found himself caught between these approaches without fully understanding the institutional logic behind them. According to accounts close to him, the realization that his son's birth certificate was being discussed in legal terms rather than celebrated and archived hit harder than any headline ever had. This was not media criticism. It was internal uncertainty, and internal uncertainty does not disappear when ignored. The emotional response came later. As details were explained and re-explained, Harry reportedly struggled to reconcile the technical language with his personal reality. Birth certificates are supposed to be definitive. They are meant to remove doubt, not introduce it. The idea that a document central to his son's identity was being reviewed unsettled him deeply. This was the moment described by the insider as the breaking point, not tears of anger, tears of grief. Grief that something he believed was settled might never feel fully settled again. Grief that certainty, once lost, cannot be restored through reassurance alone. By the end of this phase, the palace had reached a provisional conclusion. No public action would be taken. No clarification would be issued. The document would remain as filed. Internally, however, it would be treated with caution. For Harry, that decision felt incomplete. He wanted closure. The institution wanted containment. Those goals rarely aligned. This was not the end of the story. But it was the moment when Harry understood something fundamental about royal life. Public narratives can be shaped. Documents cannot. And once doubt exists on paper, it does not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Once the birth certificate entered internal review, the tone around it changed. What had initially been treated as an administrative irregularity became something more sensitive, not because anyone believed the document was fraudulent, but because it did not function the way royal paperwork is designed to function. It did not close discussion. It kept it open. Inside Buckingham Palace, advisors began approaching the issue from a risk perspective. In royal governance, uncertainty is not judged by intent. It is judged by consequence. The question was no longer whether the birth certificate was valid. It was whether it would withstand scrutiny if challenged in the future. This distinction is crucial. Royal records are not designed for today's headlines. They are designed for decades, sometimes centuries of reference. Any ambiguity, however minor, becomes amplified over time. What looks like a footnote in the present can become a fault line later. According to the Palace Insider, several specific elements drew attention. The phrasing used to describe parental information diverged from previous royal entries. Certain identifiers that usually appear consistently across royal births were handled differently. None of this implied deception, it implied deviation. And deviation, in institutional systems, demands explanation. As legal advisors examined the document, they also examined the context surrounding it, the hospital arrangements, the timing of registrations, the alignment between public announcements and official filings. Each component on its own could be justified. Together, they created a profile that was unusual enough to warrant continued monitoring. This was when Prince Harry became more directly involved. He requested briefings. He asked to see comparisons. He wanted to understand why his son's documentation was being treated differently from that of other royal children. According to those present, the explanations he received were technical and restrained. They avoided speculation, they focused on process. But process is cold comfort when family is involved. Harry reportedly struggled with the idea that something so personal was being analyzed in such detached terms. He had grown up believing that royal systems, for all their rigidity, existed to protect family. Now he was seeing the other side of that equation. Systems protect themselves first. Families are accommodated only when they align. This realization intensified the emotional strain. Behind closed doors, Harry went back and forth between denial and anxiety. At times, he dismissed the issue as overcautious bureaucracy. At others, he fixated on the implications. What would happen if questions emerged? Publicly, what would happen if records were revisited years later? What would this mean for Archie's place in history? These were not questions he had expected to face as a father. The palace, sensing the emotional toll, attempted to slow the process. Advisors emphasized that no action was being taken, that no one was questioning Harry's role as a parent, that the review was internal and precautionary. But reassurance could not undo the underlying fact. The document was not behaving as a document should. It was not definitive. This is where factions inside the palace became more pronounced. One camp argued that continuing internal discussion only increased risk.